Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I came earlier on at 12, mistakenly thinking that we would start around 12:15, 12:15 in my mind. And Sarah was here with maybe 3-4 people. I saw a lot of chairs, and I was a little bit concerned about, the traction for our. And after speaking to her, she informed me that we are oversubscribed. So that was a different moment there. But I think the attendance here, as well as the attendance of those online, is really for me a indicative, of the fact that blended finance is having its moment in the sun. I mentioned this when we launched our report in DC, which received a lot of traction, and we'll speak about that a little bit more. But I think just the degree of focus, deliberate sort of emphasis on development of blended finance tools suggests that we are to kind of the cusp of a transformative moment. I do think, though, that it's important to start with just making some very, very brief remarks about the fact that the external environment for development finance, is changing quite fundamentally. We're entering a period of constraints, very limited concessional capital, in a number of countries, donor industrialized countries, if you like. There is a renewed focus on defense at the center of the national agendas of countries, much less focus on international assistance, on the development agenda. As you know, in the UK, most other developed countries as well have significantly reduced their official development assistance as a percentage of gross national income, which used to be 0.7% for better part of the last 55, 60 years, and that is now significantly being reduced. So that's kind of the overarching framework. However, against that background, there is so much interest today, there's so much focus in the financial industry in general, with amongst DFIs, amongst multilateral development banks, and more importantly, amongst institutional investors. Institutional investors, by the way, are really the ones that matter, because those are the custodians of long-term capital, and when they are in the room, as they are here today, it's a very different conversation that we are having. In the past, I've been in this narrow development finance field for at least the last decade. Most of the discussions over the last decade, it's us talking to each other, it's us talking to European DFIs, MDBs, and so on. It's a very different conversation that we are having when you have the asset managers in the room. We also know that there's massive momentum now. We've got the CDPQ, together with 91, created the ILN network. There's also the Private Sector Investment Lab, which Ajay Banga sort of created. And there's a major focus on blended finance instruments in that conversation. It's led by the chair of Prudential. Our minister, Baroness Chapman, has also created a task team here on private capital mobilization, which we serve on together with all the large institutional investors, about 15, 16 of them represented at either chair or CEO level. EBRD, President Odile from EBRD, informed us recently also about the new initiative on her side. So there's massive momentum. This is what I'm indicating to you. There's an enabling environment for creativity, an enabling environment for fresh approaches, for new financial engineering. And my sort of, call on Sarah and the team and the Capital Solutions team has really been about us as BII wanting to play more of a leadership role, but not a thought leadership role as in just a flow of ideas. It's about thought leadership, about the practice. It's about codifying what we are actually doing, extracting lessons. So it's about the demonstration effect. And this really is what the blended finance report that we have produced. It's about looking at the actual tools, trying to find ways to replicate or enhance the replicability of these tools. So I'm very encouraged by the fact that we are now getting a firmer grasp of the potential for, coming up with the templates for the next generation of blended finance deals. We have had this very exciting mobilization competition, which the mobilization team here at BII has led. And, we have narrowed the proposals down to a short list now. But there's also a lot of learnings from those 27 proposals. And I'm going to ask the team if they haven't heard yet, but I want them to take all of those 27 proposals, because there's ideas in all of them to see what we can sort of draw as lessons out of the approaches that the different asset managers, institutional investors have proposed. So it's not just about whoever's the winning party to deploy that 50 million pounds that we have allocated. In short, I'm very excited about this area of our work because ultimately it's about how do we unlock capital for the next era of the development finance. Now I'm very, very encouraged to see that we have some real sort of thought leaders here on the with us in the room. Some we've worked with for a very long time. I specifically want to thank BCG, who's been an excellent partner of ours, not just in the production of this report, but in the thought leadership that they have provided. So very shortly, I'd like Greg Fischer to come up, who will sort of moderate the conversation, and look forward to hearing from the panelists in a moment. Thank you very much. Over to Greg Fischer, our very able moderator.
Thanks. So welcome, everybody. First of all, I just want to say what a thrill it is to actually be here. I think for those of us who've been working in the blended finance space for quite some time, it feels like almost every meeting we've had in the last 10 years has had one of two flavors. It's either been the Pollyanna version, where we've actually said to ourselves, look, blended finance is going to solve every single funding gap problem we have. You probably saw the apotheosis of that 3 years ago at COP, where it felt like blended finance was sprinkled like pixie dust over every financing shortfall. And there's the idea that, look, it can solve every problem. And then the other form of meetings that we've had are sort of the Chicken Little version, where we spend kind of hours sitting together talking about, here's a friction that means that blended finance can't scale. Here's another friction that means that blended finance can't scale. And most of those conversations originated in, largely in conference rooms. And to the point that Leslie made in the introduction, I think what's been so exciting about this work and why I'm so excited for the panel that we have together to talk today is that the ideas here are born of practice, right? They're ideas that come from the work that people have experienced over the last many years in the trenches of pulling blended finance together. And I think the report that we collectively worked on, I think has sparked a lot of interest because it is so pragmatic and really focuses on how to address a number of frictions to help blended finance start to scale. And I'll say just to help blended finance start to scale, because we recognize this is just the next step on a longer journey that's required to fill the gaps that we have. And so with that, and kind of no further ado, I'd like to invite up the panel. Actually, one further ado. I've been told that I must announce that for health and safety reasons, at 2 o'clock, a fire alarm will go off in this room. Right? Take no action at that point. Just sit and let your questions percolate so we can finish that up. But just a note that that's going to happen. So with that, I'd love to invite up our panel. We have 3 folks here in person and 1 who is joining us from Singapore. So with that, let me introduce Leticia from Allianz, and I'll let you guys come on up. Maria Teresa from BlueOrchard and Schroders, and Michael Sani from BII, and then on the phone we have Rafe from Pentagreen. So please give them a warm round of applause for joining us. So with that, I'd love for you guys just to kick off with intros and probably just working down the line right here. And if you could say a little bit about kind of personally how you work in the space, but also say a little bit about how your organization really approaches blended finance, which assets you're involved in, and what type of clients you're working with. Leticia, over to you.
Sure. Happy to start, and thank you very much for having me. So I'm Leticia Ferreras. I head the development finance team at Allianz Global Investors. We are a large asset manager. Maybe some of you might have heard of us. We're part of the large insurance company Allianz. My team specifically focuses how we relate to blended finance is that we focus on creating private debt investment strategies that help us mobilize institutional capital from Allianz as our parent company, as well as other institutional investors towards emerging markets. So much of what I do day to day is effectively structuring, launching, and investing blended funds. So we work very closely with BII as well as other public sector agencies in procuring and structuring first loss that can help us de-risk the investment from institutional investors such that they are comfortable enough with the risk that they're taking and they can deploy capital at a scalable level towards emerging markets. So very happy to be here today.
Great. Thanks, Leticia. Maria Teresa, what do you?
Maria Teresa Zappia. I am part of the management team at BlueOrchard, and actually my title is Chief Impact and Blended Finance Officer. So that tells you that blended finance is really bread and butter. For me, as you know, BlueOrchard was acquired in 2019 by Schroders. So we are very happy to have, 100% shareholders that is also very active with us in blended finance because, as we said, it's the DFI, but it's the private sector that plays an important role. Out of 5 billion of assets under management, over 1 billion is in blended finance. So it's a really important part of our business model. Of course, we have started actually in private debt, financial inclusion back in 2001. So both with fully private sector funds and blended finance funds. And now we have a practice in blended finance that extends from private debt to also private equity.
Perfect. And Michael Sani, I'm an investment director here at BII. For those that don't know, so BI is the UK's development finance institution and impact investor. We invest about $2 billion a year in private sector businesses across Africa and Asia. And that's across financial services, infrastructure, and the real economy. And that's across a pretty flexible product toolkit. So equity, debt, guarantees, funds, and pretty much everything in between. About $2 billion of our current balance sheet is in what we call is in our kind of catalytic capital portfolio. So that's capital where we are able to take a more flexible risk return position in return for impact, in return for kind of social returns. And that is very much core to how we think about blended finance. So we can put that capital to work on individual deals, but often we put that capital to work in a way that allows us to get scale in larger structures and larger funds with partners like we have here. So I'll stop there.
So, thanks, Michael. And on the video, I'd like to turn it over to Rafe from Pentagreen.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I am Rachel Erasmus. I'm Managing Director at Pentagreen Capital, where I lead on strategy and capital formation. For those who are not familiar with us, Pentagreen was established relatively young, around 3 years ago, as a joint venture between HSBC and Temasek, really to try to catalyze financing into sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia and South Asia, projects which otherwise would not achieve the capital that they require to realize such projects. We are a credit platform. We invest in debt. We focus on projects, I would say, in the single B to low double B area, mostly greenfield infrastructure, and often working with emerging developers that do not have sufficient access to financing from what we would call the traditional financing markets, i.e. commercial funders. Now, this is often we find situations where actually, when you look through, fundamentally, the situations are quite sound credit risk situations. However, for one reason or another, they simply cannot get access to capital because they deviate from what would traditionally be seen as bankable norms by commercial funders. And so the situations that we look at are actually very, very relevant for blended finance because they require a differentiated balance sheet that really blends in the right types of capital with the commensurate risk return to support these projects. So very pleased to be here to share how our thoughts on how we think about blended finance and the challenges as well that we see.
Thanks, Rafe. And actually, Rafe, I'd like to follow up on that and maybe just to forewarn you, this is a question I'd love to have all of you speak to because I think everybody in this room probably recognizes that putting blended finance structures together is actually a lot of work, right? It's complex and it's challenging. And so the question I'd like to ask, and Rafe, this is probably most easily answered by you because it's so core to what Pentagreen does, but why do you bother, right? There are so many other ways to invest capital. Why bother with blended finance?
Why do we bother with blended finance? First of all, I would say that blended finance, it's really a financing technique, right? It's using structured finance just to try to bring together different types of capital, concessionary capital, commercial capital, to get, in order to get funding to projects that really need it. And often projects that otherwise wouldn't have access to funding. And this is why we bother, because for a lot of these situations without blended finance, there may be no other solution to get capital, to get financing, to get these projects built. So despite the challenges, we persevere. And we would say that when you think right through, blended finance should not be that difficult in some ways, because, like I said, it is not a financing technique that is terribly new. It has been used before, but perhaps what is new is trying to blend in different types of capital with different types of requirements, and getting to the point where there is, would I dare to say, almost harmony in how those different types of capital can work together.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Raj. Michael, I'll let you go next on this one, because it is very core to what BII does.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think it's a different perspective also. I'm interested in Maria Teresa and Leticia's answers as well on why bother. But I think from a BI perspective, I think there's really two reasons and two constraints that we really face. I mean, and they lead us in different directions. So one is just a volume constraint. And we all know that DFI and MDB capital, if you add it all together, gets us only a very, very small part of the way to the financing we need to meet the SDGs. So that's somewhere between $2.5 and $4 trillion a year, and DFI and MDB annual commitments are in the tens of billions. So there's an imperative to almost have a false multiplier. So to get more for every single dollar that we're able to put out of the door. And that requires us to find ways to bring in private capital. And blended finance is often, but not always, a very efficient way to do that and a way to make every dollar that we have go further. So that's, I think, one big imperative, and that really leads us to look at structures where we can mobilize private capital. I'd say the other is, and sometimes we forget, but we also have risk-return constraints. And although DFIs like BI can be more flexible than many other kind of forms of private capital in how we invest and the risk return that we demand, we also face constraints around needing to be self-sufficient. Many other MDBs are not so much BI, but face constraints around needing to maintain credit ratings. And often there are many either very nascent or frontier market segments that actually we cannot finance fully from our own balance sheet. And that's often actually where we partner with more flexible forms of capital, so whether that's donors, philanthropies, to really have that kind of depth of impact. And I think that leads you to two very different types of blended finance strategies, which we also try and pull out in the report.
Thanks, Michael.
So when you asked this question in the prep call, I thought was brilliant, because it's a question that I've heard many, many times from my management team, from my board, especially when you tell them that it takes 2.5, 3 years to actually structure this fund. So people say, why don't you do something else in the meantime? Why would you bother? Right? So I really think it's a very good question. Now, my reply is that very often when I get to reply to this type of question is that it's a perfect, if you want, complementary part of our business as an asset manager. And I'll put this in very concrete words. So, as I said, we have 5 billion of assets under management. 4 billion is non-blended finance. 1 billion is blended finance. For example, we have a financial inclusion fund that is very close to $3 billion. That's an open-ended, evergreen fund. And I would say it's, financial inclusion across emerging markets, private debt. So that is a stream from a cash flow perspective that is, as I say, evergreen, open-ended, where we can have institutional investors, wealth management type of clients. And that allows us to do impact. What we have done in the blended finance structures, we have gone an extra step, if you want. So, for example, we have a private equity climate insurance fund. So there we have really built a market for climate insurance in emerging markets. So really accessibility of affordable climate insurance for smallholder farmers. And it's an investment vehicle, it's private equity, so it's 10 plus 2. So, it's totally different. Again, if you think on one side on the impact, on the other side of the financial aspects, so the add-on from an asset management perspective, 12-year, sticky money, decent fees. I don't want to say good because I don't run into trouble. Decent fees. So, but especially really a market building opportunity where in addition to really investing in private equity transactions across the insurance value chain, from insurance company to insurtechs and insurance brokers, and learning all of this, we have technical assistance. So we have a pot of money that we can do, really go to an insurance in Nigeria and say why, since they have an agricultural portfolio that they are already insuring, why climate insurance could be an add-on to their product. We have another pot of money, and this is, was all started by the German government, BMZ, and the German Development Bank, where we can do, support and integrate. It's called the Premium Support Facility. The payout, the smallholder farmers. So you realize that it's true. It takes a lot of time to set it up. Once you do it, it's brilliant. It's fantastic. It's long-term money, as I said. It's really, from an impact perspective, going the extra step. So I think, as I say, when I say, why do you bother? I feel like, because otherwise, without this blended finance component, without this, long-term patient capital, part of it as well as concessional terms, we'll never be able to crack the nut.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. I was going to say that to follow Maria Teresa, like if you're in blended finance and you haven't questioned this for yourself personally, please come see me. What's your trick? Because maybe I'm missing something. But I do think it's a question that we get a lot of, we get questions from senior management and from our organizations. But I think at a personal level, there has to be a conviction for why. So maybe to put that out there. I think it's quite, I won't repeat the same thing. It's quite obvious that we can't afford not to invest in emerging markets. So there, as Rafe was saying, it's really more about how can we do it? And that's where blended finance comes in. So the side of impact and the importance from an impact perspective is quite obvious, I would say, hopefully for all of us. I think on the other side is maybe answering the question as to why investors. So Maria Teresa really well put, like, why as an asset manager we do this? Why do investors bother, right? Because that's also a big question. And when we think about institutional capital, if they don't want to bother, then we all have a problem. So I think there's maybe two things that from the institutional investors that we work with, many of them are very committed in particular to climate. And I think it's becoming increasingly obvious to them that, and hopefully again to all of us, that we cannot solve the climate crisis by only investing in Europe and in developed markets. It really cannot be done. It's inefficient because it just won't be solvable if we don't account for emerging markets. So we see many investors that have these commitments to decarbonization, to net zero, really look at blended finance as a way for them to holistically approach those solutions. So not just addressing it in Europe and North America, but actually going the extra mile and saying, look, emerging markets, some of the countries are actually the highest emitters. If we don't do something about this, then we're kind of being a bit silly because we're trying to fix one problem on the one hand, but not looking at the other. So, and we see that, and we have these conversations, for example, with Allianz that has invested billions of dollars in emerging markets and blended finance, and they would tell you very, very openly, like, this is a big part of their climate agenda as well, right? And how they think about their future as an insurer and what that means in terms of the claims they'll have to pay if we don't address these issues. So that's, I think, one school of thought, if you will. And I think the other, also quite bluntly, if you will, is that we think it's a good investment for institutional investors. Many of them, in particular, you look at pension funds, insurance companies, they have a very high concentration of investments in Europe. That's not necessarily a good idea from a purely financial, economical reasons, right? So blended finance really gives them an opportunity to invest in emerging markets, diversify their portfolios, and still make a good amount of return compared to, other investments that they might be looking at. So, and I think that that's an argument that we need to make quite a lot, because in some cases, development is always associated with aid, which is associated with donations and grants and no return. But I think we need to change that narrative and say, like, look, blended finance can be attractive, both from, I guess, a fee perspective, but also a return perspective for investors. And that's part of how we think for investors that maybe are less concerned, if you will, about impact or sustainability. We look at the financial aspects of it and what they can get out of investments that provide a very low volatility, attractive return and long-term commitment. So that would be my answer.
And I just
Yeah, could I add to that? I just
please do.
been
Yeah, please
listening,
do.
and I wanted to pick up on something that Maria picked up mentioned, which is market building. There's often this impression of blended finance. It's being used to deliver impact, and it does. It's for people who are interested in developing countries. That is true, but also I just wanted to make the point that one of the problems we try to solve for is the fact that. And we hear about this all the time, too much commercial capital chasing the same transactions, chasing for the same deals, and there's no pipeline. So the question then is, how do you channel that commercial capital in other structures, right, and deploy that? And in the meantime, try to build a market. So if I give you an example, I mentioned in my introduction of Pentagreen that we work often with emerging developers that wouldn't get the financing that they need otherwise to build their projects. Now, as part of a broader strategy, I think is, can we get financing to these developers via blended finance structure, help them grow, help them mature, and actually in time, as that market develops, and the developers become more mature, they can be financed by the commercial market. So in some ways, blended finance structures, I think, shouldn't be seen as the end of that journey. It can be very helpful in developing a market that eventually actually can help, some companies to transition into the mainstream commercial market.
Michael, you wanted to add something as well.
No, going inside the room a bit, Leticia and I had an interesting conversation, I think last week, but I think the point on, I wonder if you want to say something about the point you made on actually in the current market volatility, what the relative attractiveness of blended finance and the kind of resilience that offers.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, actually, that's a good point as well. Yes, we were saying, there's a lot of questions now, and we're getting a lot of questions, maybe you as well, Maria Teresa, on, okay, well, emerging markets, volatility, geopolitics, all this madness, like investors are obviously a little cautious right now, kind of holding on to their capital and saying, where do we go? And it's not always the answer like, great, volatility. Emerging markets is the go-to. Hardly ever get that answer. Yeah. So I think it's again, like what we were discussing with Michael, is that it's also a positioning, right? So in some ways, blended finance, the way that the funds that we structure work is that they provide a lot of protection to investors, also from a return perspective, not just capital preservation. So that means that you're investing in our case, long-term funds that provide really low volatility. So if we can tell investors, look, you put your money here longer term, which is a preference for many of them, the volatility is very low. If you look at the public markets, which is their benchmark and what they're normally more familiar with, everything is going up and down. We're not really sure, depending on, who's announcing what new policies. There's a lot of like volatility changes, like you don't really know what you're going to get. So why don't you think about blended finance? Yes, it's emerging markets, but it comes as a structured finance product, as Rafe was saying, providing very limited volatility. So this is actually kind of a safe way for you to invest your money, especially while we're waiting for hopefully this side also stabilizing a little bit. So I think that's a strong argument in the current day and age, if you will, especially.
And one thing I love about that, and I think it's a common theme that I'd like to dive into now, is that the way you just described that, you didn't use the word impact at all. It was entirely focused on the financial needs of the institutional investors and what that meant for the way they think about managing volatility in their portfolio and investment opportunities. And I think one thing that's been really interesting, we get asked the question all the time, so what's different, right? We've been talking about blended finance for years. What's different now? And I think one of the things that we see in a lot of the work that we do, and I recognize very much that's a selected sample, but one of the things we see is more institutional investors coming to us who have no interest in impact. It doesn't arrive in polite conversation amongst them, right? Who are saying, how do I find ways to participate in blended finance? I see this as an important opportunity for either driving my assets under management or for managing volatility. And I think that brings up a lot of questions. And one, Maria Teresa, when we were talking earlier this week, you talked about how important the challenge was of bringing together people who have very different objectives, very different preferences, approach this even with a different language in the way they talk about this, and how we get them together in these blended finance structures. And I'd love for you just to speak a little bit about kind of what your experience is, both the good and the bad there, and maybe kind of tee that up if other folks want to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, no. So actually, when you just were talking now, I had another very really concrete example of a big lesson learned for us. For example, we structured, and this is actually back in 2012, a fund, private debt, financial inclusion for Asia. And at that point in time, we had this capital structure with the junior, the mezzanine, some of the archetypes of that you have shown in the paper, the junior, the mezzanine, and the senior. And day one, we said, okay, the junior is going to be, bilateral donor financing, very concessional terms. The mezzanine is going to be for the development finance institution, and the senior is going to be for private sector investors, be it family offices, institutional investors, insurance companies. And that's how we started, right? That was the idea. And then suddenly, 2 years down the road, we had an institutional investors, was a French insurer, that had invested in the senior. And we were still fundraising for the mezzanine, but it was in principle allocated to a development finance institution. And they took a seat in the board of the fund, which is really unusual for a French insurer, I'm sure, with a lot of assets under management. And but the CIO himself was sitting at the board, and then they just felt comfortable about the risk. And so they said, they called me and said, tell your DFIs that step back from the mezzanine, I want a piece of that as well. And I was like, how am I going to sort this out? I said, you were supposed to be only in the senior tranche. And I said, no, we like that return, and we want to be there in the capital stack. And so for me, that's a brilliant example of how institutional investors, in particular, knowing more about the asset class, knowing more about the markets, and really having a risk assessment that is not based on just looking at the triple C of some of these countries, but actually having looked at how we underwrite, how we do the business of selecting the partners for this. They sort of suddenly felt like, why should we leave that, nice, juicy piece of the mezzanine to, the development finance institutions? And so I had to phone and I said, guys, you have to scale back because, of course, everybody was super happy because that was exactly the topic, right? How do you get them in? From the senior to the mezzanine, and maybe one time they will have some capital stack for the junior.
For the junior as well.
We're not there yet, but you never know.
Others, any thoughts on that? Because it is, we recognize this all the time. It oftentimes feels like we are building the Tower of Babel when it comes to blended finance. That people in different pieces of the capital stack and from different backgrounds just speak a different language.
Greg, do you want to take some questions? We have
let's make this a bit more interactive. We were planning. I think we were. The idea was we were going to try and hold some of the questions at the end because this is being recorded, and I think it's easier for chopping up. But I promise we will have time for questions if we can do that. So,
Greg, could I just go for some comments, actually, some of my thoughts on what Maria just said? And I really love what you said because, actually, if the conditions are right, frankly speaking, commercial capital will come in and fund, right, if it meets their requirements. And I think one of the big challenges we often face is that, as I mentioned, blended finance structures are most relevant and should be used for situations which otherwise wouldn't get capital, which means you're intrinsically looking at situations that commercial capital providers have much less experience of. They are much less comfortable with, which is why they need that structure. But the fact that there are market transactions and the fact that they participate is very important. Precisely the point that they then gain knowledge of the markets, they get comfortable because there's track record. And blended finance is almost a progression, right, as to how you get commercial capital into these sort of structures. Because over time, as commercial capital providers just get more comfortable because there are more transactions for them to look at, I think then Maria is right. There'll be more capital coming to senior tranche. You're going to get more optimized capital structures. And commercial capital can also go down the capital spectrum to look at mezzanine at the right price. But I think what I would say is often people forget that a lot of this is about development of a market and it's a progression.
Maybe if I can come in, because I think the other thing that I completely agree, and we're seeing some progression from some investors already that are kind of going down the risk spectrum, and as they see from their own investments and funds that things are not as scary or as bad performing as maybe they initially thought, that concept of the perceived risk that we talk about quite a lot, it does make them in many cases want to take on more risk. I think maybe the nuance here is that we talk quite a lot about institutional investors as a pool, and the reality is that they're very different. You have some insurers that are very advanced and that are taking mezzanine risk or that have invested billions of dollars already in emerging markets, while there's also many insurers that don't even have any emerging market exposure, even on the public market side, right, which is considered it's liquid. I can come in and out as I want. So I think that's also part of the nuance that we need to think about when we're mobilizing capital, and which capital are we mobilizing? Are we talking European insurers, and even within that, what countries? Not to overcomplicate, because we're here to simplify, if you will. But is it pension funds? Is it North America? Is it Europe? Because that also dictates what structures we should set up, and also whether blended is necessary. I mean, we were discussing this during our prep call. Like in many cases, there's certain markets where blended is not necessary anymore. Many markets that have graduated, many investors that are comfortable enough with some of the more advanced emerging economies, if you will. And then we shouldn't be using blended finance if commercial capital is already able to go there directly. But I think we need to also think about, and this is part of the challenge of where we're at, that I'm getting the question, we were talking about it as well, getting the question of, has blended finance failed? I'm like, what? What do you mean we're already failing? Like, I haven't even had a chance to tell a lot of investors that have never heard about this. So we can't have failed if the whole market doesn't know about it yet, but the development community is super advanced on what blended is, and many institutional investors are still figuring out, like, emerging market, what do you mean? So we need to have a little bit of patience as well as everybody catches up. And in the meantime, also structure transactions and funds that, might cater to more sophisticated investors. The ones that are behind might need a bit more blending. The ones that are already advanced might need less. And of course, ideally, we can all bring them to the point where blended finance is not necessary, and we can all reinvent ourselves and do some other job.
But maybe I'll step in. So something that really doesn't work from a private sector perspective, and we've heard this over and over again. We did a DFI roundtable at the beginning of the year with 15 development finance institutions, 10 private sector investors. Was almost like a football team, right? So different T-shirts, but trying to get to the same same objectives. And something that did strike me as really important, and we often forget this, even in BlueOrchard or in Schroders when we work to investors, is that time to deployment is really key for them. Yep. You cannot have a CIO of a pension fund or an insurance company going to committee for a blended finance structure, then making effectively an investment decision and deploy funding 12 months later. Okay. That doesn't work. And it's not very often, it's not that we haven't created the portfolio. So the portfolio, has been originated, maybe in some strategies slightly more complicated, but generally it's just a question of the corporate governance that comes with it, and all the layers, and the CIO and an institutional investor, looks at you and says, I've taken an investment decision, I put money on the side, I had to fight to get this through my committee, and now you're telling me that I'm just, this $50 million ticket, which for them is called trivial, is going to take me 12 months to invest? That's not possible. So this is a big, big challenge, and we hear it over and over again. And it's, as I say, there are two challenges. One is how long does it take to get the structure? And then how long does it take to really get the structure, on a running, momentum?
Michael, I'd like to turn to you because particularly on this topic of where the frictions are on the place. And so across this both in getting the different types of participants together speaking the same language. But one conversation you and I have had a lot, and I think is embedded in the report that we all pulled together, is oftentimes one of the other frictions that exists is not just the time to deployment once you've got the IC approval, but the fact that even getting to IC approval feels like it is full of frictions. And I think in our conversations, it sounds like you have BlueOrchard and Schroders and Allianz GI, you guys have made a lot of steps in that direction, but it remains very hard to speak a common language, even internally, between the teams working on blended finance and our investment committee members who are actually working to make those decisions. How do you see the frictions there and how we're making progress forward there? And I know this is a pain point for you, that's why.
It is. I was just looking at him saying, oh my God. And plus, you have your C in front of you. So,
you can say it in front of Leslie as well.
I'm aware. I mean, maybe I'll make 1 point before I answer that question. Great. I mean, I think one of the, bits of optimism, I think we talk a lot about, how do you bring different groups of investors together? But I do think one of the important kind of evolutions we've seen in the market is bringing, frankly, different types of asset managers together. Yeah. And I think we've had a situation where, particularly for emerging markets, it's really been dominated by very specialist managers, often impact managers, sometimes boutiques, who have a very strong commitment to impact finance and blended finance, and are very good at understanding the underlying markets, deploying, but haven't always had the plug into large institutional capital. And I think on the other side, we've seen these kind of large institutional investors, mostly developed markets focused, haven't always had the emerging markets experience or the private markets experience. And I think one of the very positive evolutions we've seen actually is that coming together. Yeah. And it's come together in different forms. So, we've seen the likes of BlueOrchard and Schroders come together, similar with the responsibility in M&G. We've seen different models come to light. So actually, can you start plugging into the origination engine of the DFIs and MDBs? And we've seen Allianz do that with the likes of IFC and FMO. We've seen kind of the institutional investors come together and say, look, can we actually launch a specialist origination partner? And we've seen that with Pentagreen coming with HB and Temasek. I think that's been an area of huge progress actually in recent years in the market. And I think it's one that we shouldn't overlook, because I think having the right asset manager in the middle is the fundamental ingredient who's able to do both sides. The only other point I'll make on your comment is, and I will shamelessly steal this from Nadia at Allianz, but I think often, bringing the blended finance structures together is like, what's the term she uses? Keeping the kind of Jenga tower upright. And for good reasons, particularly the more concessional the capital gets, often concessional capital comes with a very clear-eyed focus on what it's trying to achieve. And it's often trying to achieve very hard things. So whether that's scaling up private sector adaptation across emerging markets, whether that's really focusing on the least developed countries and real frontier markets. But those things often go against the scale and diversification that institutional investors want. And it's how do you show enough flexibility throughout the structure that each person isn't taking by saying, okay, we just want this to do climate, we just want this to be a gender-focused investment, we just want it to be in frontier markets. You're not kind of taking out enough of the wooden pieces so that the block all falls down. I say this half looking at Teresa and Leticia and Rafe, who I'm sure were thinking, that's what we told you. But I think it does require more settings like this. I think we're seeing a number of kind of more structured forums, whether that's the work that people like Convergence do, whether that's the Hamburg Sustainability Platform. I think these are all the right kind of venues to have these conversations, but I think it really requires that understanding of, look, we're all trying to achieve the same thing, and actually we need to understand the constraints that each other face. I think that's happening more. I think the asset managers are the vehicle for doing that, and I think actually that's come a long way as well.
Look, so I recognize that folks in the room are chomping at the bit to ask questions, and I also know that we have 800 people signed up online. So, indication that people are not here just for the excellent BII sandwiches, but really kind of interested in the topic. So, I'd like to ask two very short questions of everyone on the panel before we open it up to questions. And so, the first one, as I think anyone who sadly spent more than 5 minutes of me knows, one of my favorite quotes is that any idiot can learn from their own mistakes. A wise person learns from somebody else's. And I would love for you to just give one small bit of wisdom that you think, gosh, I wish I would have known this 5 years ago, or here's a lesson that I've learned kind of in the trenches here that I'd like somebody else not to have to repeat my mistakes to get to that point. So whoever wants to jump on that grenade first, please start.
Shall I go?
Yeah,
Shall
please.
I break the ice? Yeah. So, because I have many, I have 4. I love to say, no, that's never happened to me. No, really. So the first thing is know your investors, right? I mean, there's no point that we're going to say that a blended finance structure is, I don't know how to say, doesn't sell, as opposed to say we didn't understand what the investor rules were. No. And I think that is really key because as we have talked before, we know insurers have really limited exposure to emerging markets. But why? They have Solvency II, they need to go through an approval. So there are, capital allocation and capital risk ratios they have to stick to. So I really feel like very often we have assumed that it's a failure of blended finance, while really we haven't done our homework in targeting the right investor group with the right, really, tool.
I think maybe a lesson learned to build on that, if you will, is I think that blended finance takes a lot of perseverance, and that's a lesson learned, I think, on a personal level, if you will. But I do think that part of it also means that as you know your investors, and even when you think about maybe focusing in more on the public sector side, what maybe I wish I knew 5 years ago, if you will, is bring the people on the table that have the most alignment. And I think that's, and what I mean by that is that when you work, especially with, I think, public sector agencies, everybody, and senior investors as well, but on the public sector agencies, there's many different, they're driven by different agendas, in many cases, different alignment or different incentives, different objectives. And I think if you're able to bring together the public sector agencies that at the very least have like a few points in common, that makes the process a lot faster, hopefully, and a lot smoother. I think the challenge is identifying the priorities and objectives, because it's not like there's a checklist online. But if you're able to identify like 2, 3 government institutions that are all going towards the same theme, the same topic, and more or less the same structures, that makes the conversation a lot easier. So I think it goes to knowing investors, but also selecting your partners and building that trust, which I know sounds a little bit cheesy, if you will, but I do think that once you have the right people at the table, making sure that you convey and you understand that everybody has the best of intentions and that ultimately we're all here for the same goal, makes the conversations a lot easier. So
I won't repeat, but I think this point on partner selection is the key one. I mean, not only do you need partners with commitment really right to the top of the organization, but they need to have the fundamental track record in what they're trying to do. And I think the structure or the investment strategy is never kind of exactly as it was in that kind of first slide of the presentation. But if you have got very credible partners with a good, strong track record, with commitment from leadership, I think that takes you a long way. And actually, if you choose the wrong partner at the start, it's hard to recover from that.
And Rafe?
Yes, I think we often talk about investors' requirements and knowing your investors' requirements. What I've learned is that it's very important to find people who have some flexibility in their capital structure, because otherwise what you find is nobody moves. And it just can't work if there is zero flexibility amongst your partners. And to that point, I would also say I've learned, as I mentioned earlier, that, and I wish that this is something, if people can take this away, is, the success of blended finance is also, as I mentioned before, a matter of progression. And so if you can, if you and your partners can understand that you may not be able to achieve every goal that you wanted to achieve at the outset in this transaction. It's not going to be perfect, but doing something, putting a successful transaction in the market, garnering, commercial capital into that, building that track record, building knowledge of markets that commercial capital otherwise would not go into, and then building on the success of each transaction. That is what we see as the success. But it does take patience, it does take time, it does take perseverance. But we think we will get there. I think the market will get there in time. But like anything that's new to the market, anything that's challenging, it takes a little bit of time. And when people see that there are opportunities, and the structures doesn't take 2-3 years to put together, the ecosystem was just built, and it was just who knows how blended finance structures will evolve, right? In the next 5-10 years, maybe it won't be needed anymore, like Letitia says. But I think that would be my key lesson is look forward.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add to that came out during the interviews we did and the work and pulling the report together is that the worst case scenario of picking the wrong partners and not having flexibility in the capital structure is not that the deal doesn't come together, is that it does, right? And then you end up with a structure that you're burdened with that is deploying much more slowly than anybody would like, that actually isn't solving anybody's goals. And so that was a theme that came up time and time again of just making sure you're really thinking about that up front, because it not only greases the skids to get things done, but means that what you're delivering really is moving towards that future that we're all aiming towards. So one last question before we open it up to the audience, because I really want to hear this. I think that there's so much optimism in the room and the sense that there's real kind of traction. And I would love for a moment to give you sort of the hypothetical magic wand, right? And to be able to say, look, if you could just change one thing in the blended finance ecosystem that you think would unlock greater scaling to solve all the problems or address the challenges that you've described before, kind of what would your wish list be, kind of from the fairy godmother here?
Well, it's hard to pick one, but I'm happy to jump in. I think the first, maybe one big one, is transparency and consistency of public money, if I'm going to put it that way. I think it's really hard to identify, and that has taken us a really long time. It's really hard to identify what each institution on the public sector side especially can do, wants to do, what type of capital they have. Can they do first loss, not first loss, mezzanine, what's the return? All of this information takes ages to gather from each of the individuals. And by the way, it changes every few years because governments change. So it's not like once you have it, you're holding a pot of gold. So I think consistency in first loss or de-risking mechanisms would be incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to give it a shot with something big, painful. So again, very conscious this will have some potential consequences, but
never invited to be AI.
Exactly. It's been really nice to be here today. But no, but I really think fast-tracking the investment process, we really cannot have really funds that take 2 years to be structured with the first IC, the second IC, the third IC, and the revision of the terms. We cannot do that. In really fast-tracking the investment process of development finance institutions is at most a priority. So if I have my ferry, I put all my money on that.
So Mike, you're going to solve that in your answer to this question.
Correct. Wonderful position. Yeah, I mean, it's similar actually. I would say that innovation isn't always a good thing. And I think there's a real attraction to doing kind of first of its kinds, and there is a place for that. But actually, I think if I had my magic wand, I would just replicate what works and scale up what works. And I think part of it is identifying, okay, what are the common themes of what works? But actually, in a year or 2 or 3 years' time, I would like to see many more of the fund structures that we have. We have a good pool of what has worked and raised capital at scale. If we could replicate each of those 5 or 10 times, that would be a dream world.
Yeah, it's funny. So we are anchor partners in Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, and I asked some of the senior leadership there when it first kicked off what their vision of success was. And the best answer I heard, very much on your point, was I want no one to think of what I do as sexy. Yeah. Right now, it is far too exciting. And what success means is it's not. And that's how we're actually going to scale this. And I think that theme is one that comes up time and time again. And last but not least, Rafe, and then I want to open it up for questions both online and in person.
Sure, I have many, so it's hard to pick one. But I think the one I would pick is what I call portfolio allocation from commercial investors. What do I mean by that? When you're trying to raise capital from blended finance structures, very often you run up against the problem of what I call the round peg, round hole problem, the square peg, round hole problem, which is you can find investors you may find investors who are interested in the proposition, who think this could be a good, investment opportunity. I like the returns, but I cannot find a home for it. And do not underestimate the challenges when investors in their institution, despite liking an opportunity, it cannot find a home. It means that they may not know how to allocate capital. It means that they do not know how to do the risk rating according to their internal policies. And that's where it gets very difficult. And it rests, I think, really on the need for institutional investors to think about how is it possible to get some allocation for blended finance as an asset class, and not treat it as a case-by-case basis, but really think of it as an asset class, as a market that is growing, as a market that is worth investing in, and helping to start build the ecosystem right internally to be able to invest in these opportunities.
Excellent, thank you. So what I'd love to do now is open it up for questions, and I want to do two things. So first of all, we're going to take a lot of questions from the audience. I'll take a couple, then we'll aggregate them together and let the panel pull together. I think what will happen timing-wise is I'll take a couple questions, then we'll all pause for a moment of reflection during the fire alarm, and then we'll answer. I think we're just a bit away. You've been waiting so patiently for about the last 20 minutes, so I'd love to start with you there in the white shirt. And we have some folks passing around mics as well.
Good. Alexis Sahar, Weybridge Partners. We do help companies to raise finance, and we show deals to funds like yours. So actually, Mary, a great thing about 2.5 years plus another year, 3 years, and then all of a sudden a French, fancy that, guys say, hey, you know what, I'm ready to do more, I'm ready to do more risk. How long does it take for them to realize out of these 3 years, would it be another 2 months, 3 months, or another 2 years while you are raising, they're developing this capability and understanding that risk reward is something that they would love to have in their portfolios?
Yeah, great question. Let's take a couple more and then we'll pull them together. So over here and like two folks right there.
David Pollock of Concilium Capital. We've raised capital for a number of blended finance funds for emerging markets. First loss tranches have a huge multiplier effect, but for many years there have been far too few providers of them. Is it getting any better? What do you see being done to create more providers? Because that's what you need to scale up, unless you can show a track record that shows you need smaller amounts.
Yeah, great question. Others at back, kind of just behind. Actually, can you pass here just so we can keep some? I think we had in order of where hands popped up. So yes, you in the whitish gray cream jacket. Yeah. I'm not colorblind. I'm just bad with names.
Andrea Webster, come from asset management. I'm just stepping into PRI, focusing on blended finance and emerging markets. I obsess about the scaling piece and how we're going to get to the trillions. And your point on the types of investors obsesses me, because I've seen a lot of products that come out and people talk about structures and I think, where are they going to land? So I'm interested, particularly Allianz and BlueOrchard. Where are you seeing the scale coming from? Like, are you packaging these structures onwards into the wholesale market? Where is that scale going to come from? Because in my mind, this needs to go into the existing plumbing of the system. I love the idea of a separate asset allocation to blended finance, but that will be years coming. So which sections of finance can take these structures within the existing plumbing of the system for us to get to scale? What do you see through your investors?
And then one more as I work my game of whack-a-mole. Sort of back there, you were very early with a hand up long ago.
Thank you. So Mauricio Preciado from Save the Children Global Ventures. We're talking about when blended finance is not going to be needed. And I want to challenge that a little, because if we look at the markets that are more mature in investment, like the UK market, blended finance is an essential component of the market working. So I just want to know how people respond to that. If you look at, for example, the investments of Better Society Capital, 15% of the investments are blended finance investments. If you look actually under some measurements, social housing is blended finance investment. So why are we trying to kill blended finance investment in the long term and not realize that some businesses, to achieve impact, will always require subsidy?
Great question, thanks. Let me turn over the panel to answer those ones that you want to kind of jump on, and then we'll come back to some of the many questions that we have online, and then other folks who are here. Let me let folks answer some of these, and we'll come back, Chris.
Good. I'll take the first one because I think was pointing at me. So the reply is that for the mezzanine investment, it took a week to make the investment. And this is because the CIO called the asset manager that they have, insurers very often have their own asset manager, said, I want you to invest, and I want to invest X million of dollars in the mezzanine tranche. So that was the call. The call then arrived to me, so it was very fast. So really, what my sort of lesson learned is that they were comfortable with the risk. And then once they were comfortable with the risk, they made an investment decision that was very, very clear from day one, and it went very fast.
Can I quickly push a bit further on? Because in some cases it takes a week, and in some cases it takes eternity. And so what was it? Do you think that there was something special, though? Because a week would be great. Yeah. What do you think it took in order to accelerate that movement up the learning curve?
Well, because they were part of the board, they were very engaged, and they had already 2 years of experience in the senior tranche. So in a way.
Okay, so 2 years and a week.
Yeah. But we never expected them in the mezzanine to start with, so it was.
But it proves the point that if you're able to, sorry to jump in, but it proves the point that once you actually get investors comfortable, they can react a lot quicker. And the problem is that with some investors, we're still in that initial stage of how do we get you comfortable? And that takes a bit of time, right? And the capital allocation point, I think, is spot on. Much of that is also like regulatory and kind of all the other barriers we're facing. So I do think investors move a lot quicker than development finance institutions. Just neither of us will be invited back, but I guess some shocking forces here. But I do think the investment process is a lot quicker if they know where they're facing.
They'll want to invite you back because they can learn from you. That's a feature, not a bug of the heterogeneity. Right?
Keeping you as our advocate.
So other thoughts on growth of first loss default guarantees, kind of where scaling is going to come from, or this notion that our role in blended finance should be to put blended finance out of business?
Maybe one thought on the first loss. So I think more and more we see guarantees coming to play, and also unfunded guarantees. I mean, the SDG loan fund of Alliance is a good case. So I am thinking that that's the way forward. If there is, limited aid and donor capital, the guarantee could be really let's say a proxy and a very useful building block, making up for less first loss.
And maybe to add to that, I think I completely agree. I think the guarantees are a capital efficient way to provide that first loss support. I think, as you say, first loss funded capital has always been scarce. I think it's particularly from governments, under competing pressure now from other priorities, including defence. What I would say, though, is the composition of that available first loss, I think, has also evolved in that, I think, to my earlier point, it used to be very, very focused on these very narrow priorities. And I think what we're seeing actually, even in recent years, is much more first loss capital coming online that is more flexible and is around how do you mobilize capital at scale into these markets. So, I mean, at BI, we've been very lucky to have a shareholder who's provided this $1 million mobilization facility, which is the first time we've had a dedicated concessional facility to mobilize at scale. But we've also seen, I mean, Altera coming from the Gulf. We've seen FinDev with a very large, flexible pool of concessional capital, which they use to help anchor the Gaia fund with MUFG. So I think the composition is also changing in a way that actually is very helpful for mobilization-focused vehicles.
And I think pulling these two answers together, I think one thing that we're seeing as well in the market is that as there is more data and awareness of what the risk profiles actually look like, more commercial providers are coming in to try and offer slices of the guarantee. We were working on a transaction recently where we actually had bids not for a broad first loss default guarantee, but both Lloyd's and Swiss Re made pitches for ensuring the performance of electrolyzers in a green hydrogen project. It was actually turned out to be the fundamental risk in being able to pull in scaling capital. And they had enough information about the performance and the risk to that they were able to price commercially, kind of taking away that risk piece. So pulling it away from what you think of as traditional blended finance and designing a product that directly addressed what was the key failure in getting to the commercial scale. And that was all possible because they understood the risks, and it was a purely financial decision on their part to make that offer. And I think we're seeing more people try to innovate around those sorts of solutions as well.
Maybe to jump in on a couple of the questions. So I think on the point on scale and investors, I'll start this saying that we are very focused on, I mean, our shareholder is an insurance company, so we do work quite a lot with insurers, and that brings certain challenges around regulation, what they can and cannot do. So, but we do, I mean, from a scaling perspective, it is trillions of euros, right, in terms of balance sheet. So that is something between Allianz and other insurers, I should say. So that is something, it's a type of institutional investor we work with really closely. We do see that the majority of the scale would come from pension funds and insurers just by virtue of the size. However, on the point of wholesale, and that's something that we've been looking into, I think it has been done in the market, but I haven't seen it at this scale that maybe we can get to, but it's something that we're discussing as well with commercial banks. Like, how do we get to maybe, I mean, more on the ultra high net worth, some of the, joint family offices, how can we bring them in at scale versus them supporting kind of the smaller funds, if you will. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity there. It comes with another set of regulation that is something that you need to look into. Obviously, there's a lot of concern going directly to the wholesale market. So maybe that's one thing. And then on the point of blended, thank you. You're completely right. I don't think, and as you were saying, the comment I think is very fair, that I think that there's a lot that we can do to progress towards reducing or eliminating blended finance in certain sectors and in certain countries. I do agree with you that it doesn't mean that we will never use blending again. I do think that certain sectors, certain countries, whether in Europe, I mean, we see it in VC, being used in VC in Europe, we see it in like countries in crises. I don't think that that's ever going to go away. So there's always going to be a role for aid and grants alone with no private capital, always a role for some blended finance. But I do think that we cannot hold on to blended finance as like the end all be all and the end of it. I agree with Rafe that this is a transition. So we also need to be very conscious that whenever it's not needed, we shouldn't use it and we shouldn't just force it for the sake of it. But otherwise, I do agree with you. We won't ever get rid of it, if you will. Yeah.
So I want to be respectful of the hundreds of unheard voices that are sending in questions through Chris. So Chris, if you could aggregate a couple together for our panel.
Yep. So I'm going to give you two questions that we can answer in the brief time we have remaining. The first one is, could you speak towards any examples of raising private capital locally from the emerging markets in which the funds are deploying? You've spoken a lot about raising it from European sources so far. And then the other question, and somewhat related, is what opportunities do you see for blended finance funds to specifically mitigate foreign exchange risk and boosting investment in LMICs?
I won't be able to give an example, unfortunately, but I can certainly give some thought on how we think about the role of regional capital in this of structures. I think very often when we speak of blended finance, and the big institutional investors like BlueOrchard, like Allianz, they've certainly made great inroads, and they've been really leaders in this space. But I think what we see increasingly as well, and we've mentioned the today's environment, of much more market volatility. For some investors, it does mean that they may decide to retract or reduce exposures to emerging markets. Regional capital then comes in and plays quite an important role, and in our thinking of putting together this sort of structures and blended finance structures, I think it's very important to keep in mind the regional capital and try to bring together a blend of not only international capital, but also the regional funders. Because what I would say is certainly regional funders, they may not be as sophisticated in some respect as the likes of Allianz, but they know their markets. It is their home ground. They are very often comfortable with the risk, or more comfortable with the risk. And also we haven't touched on one issue, and it extends in emerging markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's an issue of currency risks, and whether local currency financing can be provided, right, to companies, developers, because there isn't a liquid cross-currency market as you would see in more developed countries. And so as we think about the blended finance structures and the markets, I think very important to keep in mind regional funders. And I think in our experience that actually, in some ways, regional funders, they can understand this. They can understand the structures. You may find that actually can be quite a bit stickier capital because they're operating in their home markets or their home region, and they can bring value in providing, not only their knowledge of the local markets, but also other solutions. One of which that I can think of is currency risk.
I think that's a great way to finish up, because I know we're at time here, and I think that's probably the sign that, and with apologies to folks who still have hands up, we'll have a chance for folks to talk later, but I think we need to move on time-wise. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. I imagine people would like to ask another hour's worth of questions, but I think all we have time for right now is just to say a huge thank you to the panelists here for all the insights that they shared, and just want to offer them a big round of applause. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and then to turn it over to Sarah and to Chris from BII, who will talk a bit about the report and how BII is really bringing this to life in the practice of what they're doing today.
Thank you, Greg, and just to echo the thanks to the panelists for a very interesting, thoughtful, and honest conversation about the realities of structuring and bringing to life blended finance funds. Unusually in an event like this, we think most of you have actually read the paper, so we're not going to spend too much time presenting what's actually in the paper. But we did want to just share a little bit about our own experience of actually using the tools that we wrote about in there. There are two tools mentioned in the paper. Hopefully, as you know, there's a typology and there's a scorecard. So I'll say a couple of words about the typology and some of the trends that we see in the application of the typology to our own portfolio and in the market. And then Chris will speak a bit about the fact that we've just back tested our portfolio with the scorecard as well. So the typology, which, as I say, I hope you're kind of broadly familiar with, distinguishes 5 different archetypes of funds. It looks at the purpose of the fund, whether it's a pioneering or a mobilization strategy that Michael talked a bit about earlier. It looks at the level of risk appetite that the commercial or private capital is willing to take, more limited on the left-hand side on kind of types A and B, high in the middle, and kind of moderate on the right-hand side. And it looks at the underlying risk return of the actual assets that the funds are investing in. And in the report, we give reference points, case studies, and template waterfalls so that when people are designing, structuring, and doing diligence on funds, you can actually kind of have some benchmarks for what these might look like. We developed them based on our experience, kind of from sort of what we thought we were seeing in the market, and then we back tested it with our own portfolio, our pipeline, what data there was available in the market, and also the information that we had from the recent call for proposals that we've just run under the mobilization facility. And we found, from what we're seeing, we think kind of 90% plus of the blended finance funds fit into these 5 categories. We're not wedded to the exact typology, and I think we tried to stress quite clearly in the report that that this is sort of the beginning of what we want to see as a common language in this space. But we think it's a pretty good starting point. And I guess to that point, when we look at our own portfolio, we have 15 blended finance funds right now in the BII portfolio. What we can see at the moment is that most of the blended finance funds that we have today are on the pioneering side. That matches, I guess, kind of the history of the catalyst capital that we've had available and the mandate that we've had over the last 5 to 10 years. They tend to be a bit more Africa focused. I have to say the mobilization ratios on those funds tend to be a bit lower, and they're slightly smaller funds, kind of less than 500 million in most cases. What we are seeing is in recent years and in the pipeline that we have today, and we've got 5+ funds in the pipeline that are blended, we can see a shift towards the right-hand side. So we have more pipeline that is in categories D and E, and maybe a couple in C that are sort of starting to come into the market as well. There are certainly less in the market in category C or archetype C. Overall, but we do think it's quite distinct, and so it's worth having there. And there are some, and there's a case study in the paper about that. I think our experience of portfolio and pipeline maps to what you see in the market and what Convergence last 2 weeks ago kind of announced in terms of what they're seeing. There is kind of 50% of deals are climate focused, 60% of blended finance transactions are climate focused. We're seeing kind of a shift towards climate and that kind of, and what they also reported was this sort of new breed of very large $1 billion, they called them whale funds. And so that's kind of tending towards the right-hand side here. Interestingly, what we're finding is that we have asset managers now coming to us with pitches where they name their funds using these archetypes. So we think that this is proving to be quite useful. Again, we'd like to hear from other people about whether it's resonating with you. What we have heard so far is that it is. And so we're actually able to kind of start accelerating the conversations and progress quicker by actually using these to kind of provide those reference checks. Let me hand over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'll speak towards our scorecard briefly. So the scorecard was born out of a real pain point. From whenever we originated a blended finance fund, we, of course, had robust frameworks in place for assessing the commercial and impact risk, but we didn't have a consistent method for assessing the risk around the actual structure of the fund itself. So this challenge was particularly acute whenever we went to IC, and it was clear that we didn't have a rigorously and systematic way of benchmarking these funds. So last year, we began working on developing the scorecard and looked at our portfolio and kind of identified what were some of the key areas of risk that we were seeing and developed a prototype. This was later refined through our work with BCG and published in the paper that we put out in April, of course. So what I would like to do in the time we have left, and it's not very much right now, I apologize for rushing, is just briefly go through, remind you what the scorecard is and go through how we applied it at BII. So as Sarah mentioned, we back-tested our entire portfolio. On the slide here, you can see in the bottom corner a template for the way that we've structured this. That's an example there, but it basically is a very clear, concise way of communicating how the fund is structured, as well as other key metrics, and importantly, all of the qualitative elements around the structural test that we're looking at, and the RAG rating associated with them. So let's go through those very briefly. The first part of the scorecard is there compelling rationale to justify the use of blended finance? And here we're looking at two areas primarily. One, is there sufficiently strong impact that there needs to be concessional capital here to justify the use of that? And then two, is there evidence that concession is needed alongside the tranching and the pooling already there? From what we're seeing in our portfolio, this isn't actually emerging as a really primary area of risk. Part of this is due to the selection bias of our process. We have very rigorous impact frameworks, and so any funds that aren't sufficiently impactful are unlikely to make it through our process and therefore won't be in our portfolio. However, we have noticed that some of the funds, this in a few cases, have been flagged on the side of perhaps having suboptimal levels of diversification, which perhaps could have de-risked the fund further before they went out looking for concessionality. That's something that's come up a couple of times in a lesson that we've learned and we'll probably push for as we continue to look at blended finance fund allocations. The second dimension is looking at if there's an appropriate blended finance structure. So we're asking, does the structure match the target investors with the appropriate risk return profiles? Are the tranches sized appropriately to deliver the right amount of concession, not too much or not too little? And then also, are the tranching and waterfall mechanics clearly understood? And so I'll share one observation on this. We flagged a handful of funds in our portfolio where we view the waterfall as being particularly complex. When you drill down into that, what we found is that this was typically driven by structures that were tailored to meet the specific requirements of a single investor. Likely adding additional tranche to the fund structure, and then having the implications of that roll through the waterfall. I think this was touched on by the panel a bit, having these diverse investor needs, and this is quite challenging in practice as well, especially as the fund begins to grow and age. The final dimension that I'll speak towards is if there's sufficient alignment between the investors and the fund manager. This is obviously a typical part of any type of fund diligence, but in this context, we're looking at it in the context of the structure itself. What kind of structural issues might arise? And one of the key ones that we find is when there's weak LP alignment around geographic allocations. Many DFIs have very specific areas where they're able to invest. Concessionary capital is the same. And that leads us to oftentimes creating side letters where there are excuse rights around certain types of markets where you can invest. In the funds we're invested, we have a handful where we've seen this, and that leads to serious complications in how the first loss is able to absorb any types of losses, especially if that concessionary capital can't absorb losses from the full scope of the portfolio's geographic footprint. So this is an area of risk that we are very keen to monitor going forward. Wish I could speak more about some of our lessons, but I'll try to jump ahead to wrapping up and going through what are the lessons from the process of applying this. And I have 4 here. The first one is the scorecard is a risk assessment tool. It's not a pass or fail. It's designed really to surface these structural risk in the fund itself. And that's meant to inform internal discussion and to steer negotiations. Don't think of it as a go, no go, but think of it as the start of a conversation. The second one is this scenario analysis is essential. So when we look at some of these funds when they're first developed at entry point, they change substantially as the fund is deployed and as sometimes things, as they will do, don't go to plan. And so it's important when you're looking at the scorecard to think through it in terms of what this might look like, what the structure might look like in a stress scenario. Is there sufficient concessionary capital under the most stress scenario you can imagine? The last one is building the scorecard is an iterative process, both throughout the fundraising process. At first close, the fund will look different than at final close, and you need to continue to monitor that and update that process. And then after the fund is live, you'll notice that there might be elements of the structure that weren't clear at entry, and you'll need to go back and flag those in your scorecard. And the last point is that scorecards are more than just a diligence tool. At BII, we now periodically review the scorecard data at the portfolio level. And that's, I think, where you begin to get real insights and be able to identify trends and correlations that can inform how you move forward. If we expand on that even further, we'd love to be able to see this at a macro level, having data from a number of different partners and organizations so that we can really begin to wrap our heads around, what is truly best practice and then correlate that to outcomes. So thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out to all of us if you'd like to learn more about some of the things that we're observing. Most of us are very keen to talk about that. And I'm going to turn it over to Ali Khan Jamal to close out the session.
Right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So over the last 90 minutes, we've taken a deep dive inside the capital stack. Now, before we look ahead, let me begin by first thanking our speakers, panelists, and every one of you in the audience for your candor, for your questions. You've made this rigorous and inspiring. Also, thanks to BII for hosting us and the fantastic sandwiches that I know that Greg's greatly enjoyed. I wanted to share a bit of a confession, and I do hope that my colleagues at BCG and my compatriots at BII don't get too frustrated by this, but when we first started talking about writing a report on blended finance, I had some serious misgivings. Right? I don't know exactly how many reports there are on blended finance, but I'm pretty sure it's north of 100. If there's anything that is scaled, it's the blended finance report industry. Right? Okay. This was a very unusual setup. It wasn't a client consulting firm setup at all. It was two organizations coming together, investing a lot of team time, pulling people away from their day-to-day to create some IP, committed to doing it open source, as Leslie had said at the outset, but most importantly, to bring a practitioner perspective. Different practitioners, different vantage points, looking at real data to think about how do we now cross the threshold from evangelizing about blended finance to just the grubby work of market building, right? So if there's one sentiment I want to leave you with, it's this, that the type of discussion we are having today around pragmatic reference, structures, and repeatability, it marks the turning point of a sector that is getting serious about this. And it's the people in this room that will actually need to start taking this forward and making that happen. So let me talk a little bit about that. But just one last thing I wanted to pick up from what Leslie had said at the outset, which I think is very important. And I think our panelists echoed some of this as well. Look, there are structural barriers that used to slow us down are being chipped away. There are regulatory conversations that are warming. Capital stack archetypes are giving us a common language. And frankly, the external environment is creating an even deeper imperative to make every dollar work harder, right? So the question isn't about if this market will grow, but who will shape it. And one thing that I want us to not be shy about saying, but who will capture the value of this market that we're creating, right? And I think our panelists talk quite articulately about that question. So today's discussion of the report by BII and BCG gives us exactly the kind of pragmatic guidance the market is looking for, we like to believe, but we want to just also approach that with a bit of humility, and we have 3 asks for you. The first ask, my first ask to all of you in this room, take these tools, abuse them, improve on them, challenge us. Run your own funds through the scorecard, kick the tires on the archetypes, tell us where they crack. Only by collective real-world use will we surface the exceptions, iterate and refine, and develop really rigorous reference points that investors can underwrite in days rather than months or years, as we've been hearing. Right? So the report itself surfaces the same challenge. Adopt the archetypes, benchmark your proposals, and share the data back with the ecosystem, which takes me to my second point. Data, data, data. Any market building does require data, and we know that. So if we want faster closings, credible pricing, we need a step change in structuring data, leverage ratios, tranche performance, default and recovery rates. Comparable data sets are the only way to turn today's art into an asset class. And I think we all know that. So several of you are already contributing to platforms like GEMS. I encourage all of us to make structured reporting the norm, not the exception. Third, I want to acknowledge the unanswered questions that still keep CIOs awake at night that we weren't able to address in this report. We want to be very transparent. We were very specific about what we wanted to work on, but left big questions still to work on in the future. Chief among them, I think, is actually something that Chris highlighted in the framework, the scorecard, which is what is the right level of concessionality for a given impact. Look, the scorecard obviously offers guardrails, testing whether junior tranches are sized to deliver the right level of concessionality without over-subsidizing. But we're still a long way from the benchmarks that tie concessionality to impact intensity or sector risk in a predictable way. So we need to crack that code. And cracking that code will take joint experimentation and radical transparency. So the report quite rightly focuses on fund design, but many of you know from lived experience there are several adjacent challenges that determine whether good designs translate into deployed capital. And I think some or all of these were surfaced in the panel's discussion today. I wanted to share a few that we and other partners across the ecosystem are rolling up our sleeves on. I think the first thing is some of the work before we even get into having a structure is actually really fundamental. One of the most important is a sharper articulation of the market failures that we're trying to address and the ambition that we have. So before legal documents are drafted, sponsors need a crystal clear view of the real economy problem they're solving and calibrate the scale of capital and nature of blending that's required. The second that we're working on a lot and we're seeing is particularly key, and I think it's interesting to hear some of the discussions around this that came up in a lot of different ways, what we call design and align. Right? So even the most elegant waterfall will stall if the right mix of actors is not at the table early. So a design process that includes facilitated alignment between all the different actors in the capital stack, it's crucial and has proven as important as the term sheet itself. I want to see whether we can actually grant one of the wishes that was actually surfaced, Letitia. This issue around consistency of transparency in concessional financing, right, is actually something that we see great work starting to happen on, which we're supporting around a concessional capital repository that is directly designed to address this question and provide that transparency on the different types of capital, the requirements, and massively reduce the frictions in bringing that all together. One of the other things that we touched on a little bit was around an investment-ready pipeline. So once capital is raised, many funds hit a wall in deployable deals, but moving beyond high-level landscaping and onto hands-on origination, incubating transactions, and providing technical assistance to support all of that is becoming mission-critical. And the final one that we're seeing a lot of activity on is actually a perennial question, and it's around impact measurement. So impact measurement that we all actually trust, as it were. Sophisticated LPs are asking for metrics that are decision relevant, auditable, comparable across vehicles. So we're working with a lot of managers to tighten the causal links between structure, concessionality, impact outcomes, and to embed those metrics into fund governance from day one and try and create that common language across those. So let me just have an open invitation here. If you are wrestling with any of those issues, we'd love to compare notes and collaborate where possible. So let me close with a provocation here. Look, blended finance, it has great potential. I think we all know that. That's why we're all in this room, right? It's not going to close the whole SDG gap. We also know that. But it can tilt billions, possibly more, towards climate development priorities. It's a potential commercial market that could operate at scale. But we've all known this for a while, right? Look, it's dangerous to time the market, but I'm going to take that risk. This is a market whose potential time has come. But whether we get there depends on whether each of us does the following things when we leave this room. Use the tools, share the data, push the frontier questions. And if we commit to these actions, I'm confident that in a year from now, when we reconvene, the report out will be less like a blueprint, as we've shared today, and more like a track record. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to building the market together.